Not near a campfire or on a trail where a man might fall. Not in the dirt outside a saloon where violence was common and expected. It was found propped against the split-rail fence along the old cattle road, 3 miles east of Coleridge, Kansas. The clothes were dust-worn but intact. The boots were good leather, and across the chest, dulled by wind and sun, was a sheriff's star. No one in Coleridge had reported a missing lawman. No telegram had come from neighboring counties. No wanted poster carried the face. The badge itself bore no town name, no engraving, nothing to say where it came from or who had pinned it there. The man had no gun, no horse, no papers, just the uniform and the star. And when the town clerk checked the records going back 10 years, there was no mention of him at all. It was as if he had never existed. Yet someone had dressed him like the law. Someone had left him there to be found. And in a place like Coleridge, where every stranger was noted and every transaction remembered, that kind of mystery did not sit quiet. In the spring of 1887, Coleridge was a town that had learned to survive by keeping its head down. It sat in the crease of 2 low hills, where the railroad had promised to run, but never did. What remained was a single dusty street, lined with clapboard storefronts, a mercantile, a livery, a chapel that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a saloon called the Irons that never closed its doors. The people who lived there were farmers mostly, and a few ranch hands who worked the scrubland to the south. They were quiet folk, the kind who knew how to read the sky and keep their thoughts to themselves. There had been no sheriff in Coleridge for nearly 3 years. The last one, a man named Orley Taft, had ridden out one morning to settle a fence dispute and never came back. Some said he had taken off for California. Others said he had crossed the wrong man and ended up in a shallow grave somewhere past the ridge. Either way, the county had not bothered to replace him. Coleridge was too small, too far from anywhere that mattered. If trouble came, people handled it themselves or let it pass. But the body changed things. It was a boy named Samuel Pruitt who found it. He had been driving his father's wagon to town before sunrise, hauling a load of early potatoes to sell at the mercantile. The road was empty, the air still cool, and Samuel had been humming a tune his mother sang while she worked the stove. Then he saw the shape against the fence. At first, he thought it was a scarecrow someone had left behind, or maybe a coat hung out to dry. But as the wagon drew closer, the details sharpened. The boots, the trousers, the star catching the first pale light. Samuel pulled the horses to a halt and sat very still, his throat tight, his hands gripping the reins until his knuckles went white. He did not approach. He did not call out. He turned the wagon around and rode hard back to his father's farm, and when he arrived, he could barely speak. By midday, half the town had gathered along the cattle road. The body had been moved to the back room of the mercantile, laid out on a long table usually reserved for sorting feed sacks. The owner, a thin man named Horace Lyman, stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, watching the faces that came and went. No one lingered long. No one wanted to be the first to say what they were all thinking. The man had been dead for days, maybe longer. His face was weathered, his hair dark and streaked with grey. He might have been 40 or 50. It was hard to tell. There were no visible wounds, no blood, no marks of violence. He looked in a strange and unsettling way, peaceful, but it was the uniform that drew every eye. The shirt was buttoned to the collar, the trousers were clean, the star was pinned with care, as if someone had taken the time to make sure it sat straight. Whoever had done this had not been in a hurry. Horace Lyman sent word to the county seat in Adler Springs, 20 miles west. A reply came by evening. The county marshal would send a deputy within the week, but no sooner. There were other matters pressing, other towns in need. Coleridge would have to wait. That night, the saloon was fuller than usual. Men sat at the tables nursing whiskey and speaking in low voices. They spoke about the body, about the badge, about the lack of answers. Some wondered if the man had been a lawman gone rogue, hiding out under a false name. Others thought he might have been a drifter who stole the uniform. someone playing at authority for reasons no one could guess. A few, the older ones who remembered Orley Taft, suggested the two disappearances might be connected, but no one knew, and that, not knowing, settled over the room like smoke. There was a woman in Coleridge named Iris Calloway who ran a boarding house at the north end of town. It was a narrow two-story building with a sagging porch and rooms that smelled of linseed oil and old wood. She rented to travelers passing through, to ranch hands between jobs, to anyone willing to pay $1 a night and keep quiet. Iris was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, with dark hair she kept pinned back and a way of listening that made people tell her more than they intended. She had lived in Coleridge for 8 years, ever since her husband died in a threshing accident outside Hayes. She did not talk about him much. She did not talk about much at all, really, except what was necessary. But people trusted her, and when something strange happened in town, they often found themselves on her porch, asking what she thought. 2 days after the body was found, a man came to her door. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low. He carried no saddlebags, no rifle, nothing that suggested he had traveled far. He said his name was Caleb Rust, and he needed a room for a few nights. Iris studied him for a moment, then nodded and led him inside. He took the room at the end of the hall, the one with a single window that looked out over the empty fields. He paid in advance in silver coin and asked no questions. Iris brought him water and a lamp, and when she turned to leave, he spoke. "I heard there was trouble here recently." Iris paused in the doorway. "Depends what you call trouble." "A body. A man in a sheriff's uniform." She looked back at him. His face was difficult to read in the dim light. "News travels fast. It does when it's strange." "You knew him?" Caleb Rust shook his head slowly. "No. But I knew men like him." Iris did not ask what that meant. She left him alone and went downstairs, but the conversation stayed with her. There was something in his tone, something careful and deliberate, that suggested he had not come to Coleridge by accident. The next morning, Iris saw him standing outside the Mercantile speaking with Horace Lyman. She could not hear what was said, but she watched the way Horace gestured toward the back room, the way Caleb nodded and stepped inside. He was in there for a long time. When he returned to the boarding house that evening, Iris was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. He climbed the steps slowly and stopped beside her. "You see him?" she asked. "I did." "Recognize him?" Caleb shook his head. "But I recognize the work." Iris frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked out toward the road, toward the fading light on the hills. "Someone wanted him found. Someone wanted people to ask questions. Why?" "That," Caleb said quietly, "is what I intend to find out." Over the following days, Caleb Rust moved through Coleridge with a quiet persistence. He spoke to the boy who found the body. He walked the cattle road, studying the fence line and the dirt. He asked questions at the saloon, careful and indirect, about travelers who had passed through in recent weeks, about strangers, about anyone who had acted out of place. He did not present himself as law, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who had been. People began to notice, and with noticing came suspicion. One evening, a rancher named Virgil Cade confronted him outside the irons. Virgil was a broad man, with sun-scorched skin and a reputation for settling disputes with his fists. He stood in front of Caleb with his arms crossed, his voice low and edged. "You got business here, or are you just stirring dust?" Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "I'm looking for the truth." "Truth about what?" "About who that man was, and why someone dressed him up like a lawman." Virgil spat into the dirt. "Maybe he was a lawman. Then where's his town? Where's his record?" Virgil had no answer to that. He stared at Caleb for a long moment, then stepped aside. But the tension did not leave. It hung in the air between them, unresolved. Iris found Caleb later that night, sitting alone in his room with a lantern burning low. She knocked softly, and when he looked up, she stepped inside. "You're making people nervous," she said. "I'm making someone nervous," Caleb replied. "The rest are just wondering why." "You think someone here did this?" "I think someone here knows more than they're saying." Iris sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "You used to wear a badge, didn't you?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "A long time ago." "What happened?" "I made a mistake, and someone paid for it." There was a weight in his voice that Iris recognized. She had heard it before, in the voices of men who carried guilt like a stone in their chest. She did not press him further. "What do you think happened to him?" she asked instead. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I think he was killed somewhere else. Brought here, staged. The uniform, the badge. It's a message. To who? To whoever was supposed to find him." Iris felt a chill run through her. "And if that person doesn't come forward?" Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something close to fear in his expression. "Then the message will be delivered another way." That same night, a fire broke out at the livery. It started in the back stalls, where the hay was stacked high and dry. By the time anyone noticed, the flames had climbed the walls and spread to the roof. The townspeople came running with buckets, with blankets, with anything they could carry, but the fire moved faster than they could contain it. The horses screamed and kicked, and two men dragged them out one by one, their eyes wild with panic. By dawn, the livery was a blackened shell. No one had been killed, but the damage was done. And when Horace Lyman walked through the wreckage later that morning, he found something that made his blood run cold. Pinned to a charred beam, untouched by the flames, was a second sheriff's star. Caleb stood beside him, staring at the badge in silence. The metal was old, scratched, but unmistakable. Horace's hands were shaking. "What does this mean?" Horace whispered. Caleb did not answer right away. He reached out and unpinned the star, turning it over in his fingers. On the back, etched in rough letters, was a single word: witness. And in that moment, Caleb understood. This was not about the dead man. It was about what he had seen. And someone in Coleridge knew exactly what that was. Into Part 2, The Silence and the Hunt. The morning after the fire, Coleridge woke to ash and unease. The smell of burned wood hung over the town like a pall, drifting through windows and settling into clothes. People moved through their routines with a new wariness, glancing over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. The second badge had changed everything. What had been a mystery was now a threat. Caleb Rust stood in the ruins of the livery, the star still in his hand, the word etched on its back, witness, repeated itself in his mind like a drumbeat. He had seen this kind of thing before, years ago when he wore a badge himself. Messages left for the living, warnings carved into the world by people who wanted to be remembered or feared. But this was different. This was deliberate, controlled. Whoever had done this was not acting out of passion or rage. They were following a plan. Horace Lyman stood a few paces away, his face pale and drawn. He had not slept. None of them had. The town's few volunteer firefighters had worked through the night, and now they sat exhausted on the steps of the mercantile, their hands blackened with soot. "Someone's playing games with us," Horace said quietly. Caleb slipped the badge into his coat pocket. "No, someone's sending a warning." "To who?" "To whoever knows what that dead man saw." Horace looked at him, confused. "How do you know he saw something?" "Because they dressed him as law, because they left him where he'd be found, and because now they're reminding us that there are people still here who remember." Horace swallowed hard. "You think someone in this town killed him?" "I think someone in this town knows who did." By midweek, the deputy from Adler Springs finally arrived. His name was Earl Gibbons, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He rode in on a chestnut mare, dismounted outside the mercantile, and asked to see the body. Horace led him to the back room. The dead man was still there, covered now with a sheet that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Earl pulled it back and studied the face for a long time, saying nothing. Then he examined the uniform, the badge, the boots. He ran his fingers along the seams of the shirt, checked the pockets, turned the star over in his hand. "No identification," Earl said at last. "No marks, nothing." "That's what we thought," Horace replied. Earl covered the body again and stepped outside. Caleb was waiting near the door. The two men regarded each other with the careful neutrality of people who had once occupied the same world. "You Rust?" Earl asked. Caleb nodded. "I heard you've been asking questions." "Someone has to." Earl's expression did not change. "That someone is me now. Then we can work together." Earl shook his head slowly. "I work alone. You're a guest here, Mr. Rust. Best you remember that." Caleb said nothing. He watched as Earl walked back to his horse, took a notebook from his saddlebag, and began writing. The deputy spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing people: Samuel Pruitt, Virgil Cade, the livery owner, the bartender at the Irons. He asked the same questions Caleb had asked, and he received the same answers. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The dead man was a stranger, and strangers passed through all the time. By evening, Earl was frustrated. He sat in the saloon with a glass of whiskey, his notebook open on the table, filled with notes that led nowhere. Caleb entered quietly and took a seat across from him. "Find anything?" Caleb asked. Earl looked up, his jaw tight. "Nothing that helps." "Then you're asking the wrong questions." "And what should I be asking?" Caleb leaned forward. "Ask about Orley Taft." Earl frowned. "The old sheriff? He's been gone 3 years, and no one knows why. People leave Rust. Especially out here, not without a reason." Earl closed his notebook and drained his glass. "You think this dead man has something to do with Taft?" "I think someone wants us to think about Taft." Earl studied him for a long moment, then stood. "I'll look into it, but don't get in my way." He left the saloon, and Caleb sat alone, staring at the amber reflection in his own glass. He thought about the word on the badge, witness. He thought about Orley Taft, about a man who had ridden out one morning and never returned. And he thought about the question no one had asked yet. What if Taft had come back? The investigation stalled within a week. Earl Gibbons returned to Adler Springs with a promise to follow up on leads, but everyone knew there were none to follow. The county had no record of the dead man. No town within 100 miles reported a missing lawman. The badge itself was too old to trace, the kind that had been sold by traveling merchants decades ago. Without a name, without a witness, without a clear crime, there was nothing to pursue. The body was buried in the town cemetery, beneath a simple wooden marker that read, "Unknown." A handful of people attended. Iris Calloway brought wildflowers. Horace Lyman said a few quiet words. Samuel Pruitt stood at the edge of the gathering, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his face pale. He had not been the same since he found the body. His mother said he woke at night sometimes, staring at the ceiling, unable to speak. Caleb did not attend the burial. Instead, he rode out to the cattle road where the body had been found. He walked the fence line, studying the ground, the posts, the way the road curved past the hills. There were no tracks left, no signs of struggle. The earth had been swept clean by wind and time, but something about the location nagged at him. It was not random. It was a crossroads of sorts, a place where travelers heading east would pass, a place where someone would be seen. He knelt and ran his fingers through the dirt, then looked back toward town. From here, you could see the steeple of the chapel, the roof of the mercantile, the edge of the boarding house. Whoever had left the body had chosen this spot carefully. They had wanted it to be discovered quickly. They had wanted the town to see. As Caleb stood, he noticed something carved into one of the fence posts. It was faint, almost invisible beneath layers of weathering and dust. He leaned closer and brushed it with his thumb. Letters. 3 of them. O to Orley Taft. When Caleb returned to town, he went straight to Iris. She was in the boarding house kitchen, kneading dough for the evening meal. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up as he entered, and something in his expression made her stop. "What did you find?" she asked. "Orley Taft's initials, carved into the fence post where the body was found." Iris wiped her hands on her apron, her face unreadable. "That doesn't mean anything. Taft used to ride that road all the time. He could have carved it years ago. Or someone carved it recently to make us think of him." "Why?" Caleb leaned against the counter. "Because Taft disappeared under strange circumstances, and now a dead man shows up dressed like a lawman with no name and no past. Someone's drawing a connection." Iris folded her arms. "You think the dead man is connected to Taft's disappearance?" "I think he knew what happened to Taft, and I think that's why he was killed." Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There was a man who came through here about a month ago. He stayed one night, paid cash, didn't give a name." Caleb straightened. "What did he look like?" "Tall, thin, dark hair going grey. He asked about the old sheriff, wanted to know what happened to him." "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that no one knows. And then he left the next morning. I didn't think much of it." Caleb felt something shift inside him. "Did he say where he was going?" Iris shook her head. "But I saw him talking to Virgil Cade before he rode out." Virgil Cade lived on a ranch 5 miles south of Coleridge, a sprawling piece of scrubland dotted with cattle and bordered by dried creek beds. Caleb rode out the next morning, arriving just after dawn. Virgil was mending a fence near the main house, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cool air. He looked up as Caleb approached, his expression hardening. "You're not welcome here, Rust." Caleb dismounted. "I just need to ask you something." "I don't owe you answers. You talked to a man about a month ago, stranger, asking about Orley Taft." Virgil set down his tools and wiped his hands on his trousers. So what did he want?" "Same as you. Answers about a man who's been gone 3 years." "And what did you tell him?" Virgil's jaw tightened. "I told him to leave it alone, that digging up the past doesn't do anyone any good." "Why would you say that?" "Because it's true." Caleb stepped closer. "What are you afraid of, Virgil?" For a moment, Virgil said nothing. Then he looked away toward the hills. "Orley Taft wasn't a good man, Rust. He did things. Took money from people who couldn't afford to pay. Looked the other way when he should have stepped in. When he disappeared, most folks figured it was justice catching up to him. And the man who came asking? I told him the same thing. And I told him if he kept asking, he'd end up like Taft." Caleb felt the weight of those words settle over him. "You think someone killed Taft?" Virgil met his eyes. "I think Taft crossed someone who didn't forgive. And I think that stranger came looking for proof. Did he find it? I don't know. But a week later, that body showed up on the fence line." The story began to spread. Slowly at first, whispered over drinks at the Irons, murmured between neighbors at the Mercantile, then louder, faster, carried by traveling ranch hands and peddlers who moved between towns. The tale of the dead lawman and the missing sheriff, the initials carved into the fence post, the second badge in the burned livery, the word witness. People began to speculate. Some said Orley Taft had been murdered by a gang he had crossed, and the dead man was one of them, killed to keep him silent. Others claimed Taft had faked his own death and was living under another name, and the body was someone sent to find him. A few believed the dead man was Taft himself, brought back and dressed in his own uniform as a final insult. No one knew the truth. But everyone had a theory. As weeks turned to months, the tension in Coleridge began to fade. Life returned to its rhythms. The livery was rebuilt. The chapel held services. The Mercantile stocked its shelves. People stopped talking about the body, or at least they stopped talking about it openly. But the unease remained, buried beneath the surface like a splinter that would not heal. Caleb stayed in town longer than he had planned. He took odd jobs, repairing fences, hauling supplies, anything to keep himself occupied while he continued to ask questions. Iris let him stay at the boarding house, even when he could not always pay. She saw the way he moved through the days, restless and searching, and she understood. He was not looking for answers anymore. He was looking for absolution. One night, as they sat on the porch together, she asked him about the mistake he had mentioned, the one that had cost someone their life. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was sheriff in a town called Redstone. Little place, not much different from this one. There was a man accused of murder. No proof, just rumors. I arrested him anyway, put him in a cell, told him we'd sort it out. What happened? A mob came that night, broke down the door, dragged him out, hanged him from a tree in the square." Iris closed her eyes. "And he was innocent?" Caleb nodded. "Found out 2 days later. The real killer confessed. That wasn't your fault. I put him in that cell. I didn't protect him." Iris reached out and placed her hand over his. "You can't fix the past, Caleb, but you can stop it from happening again." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope. As autumn turned to winter, and winter to spring, the mystery of the dead lawman became part of Coleridge's history. The kind of story people told to newcomers, the kind of legend that grew with each retelling. Some said the man's ghost walked the cattle road at night. Others claimed the badge still carried a curse. Children dared each other to visit the grave after dark. But Caleb did not forget, and neither did Iris. Then, in the spring of 1888, a letter arrived at the boarding house. It was addressed to Iris, but it had been forwarded from a post office in Adler Springs. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places. Inside was a single page torn from a journal. "I know what happened to Orley Taft. I was there, I saw it. If you want the truth, come to the old mill outside Hayes. I won't wait long." There was no signature, no name, just a date, 3 days from now. Iris showed the letter to Caleb that evening. He read it twice, his expression unreadable. "Could be a trap," he said. "Could be the answer," Iris replied. Caleb folded the letter and handed it back. "Then we go." And in that moment, the hunt began again. Part 3. The Truth and the Legacy. The old mill stood 15 miles west of Hayes, on the edge of a creek that had run dry years ago. It was a skeletal thing, all weathered wood and rusted metal, leaning into the wind like something too tired to stand. The wheel that had once turned with the current now hung motionless, half buried in sand and dead grass. No one had worked there in a decade. No one had reason to. Caleb and Iris arrived just before noon on the 3rd day. They had ridden together from Coleridge in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The spring air was warm but carried the threat of rain, and the sky pressed low and grey over the plains. As they approached the mill, Caleb drew his horse to a stop and studied the building. No smoke, no movement, no sign of life. "Stay close," he said quietly. Iris nodded. She had brought nothing with her but the letter, folded in her coat pocket. Caleb had his revolver, though he kept it holstered. Whatever they were walking into, he did not want to begin with violence. They dismounted and approached on foot. The door to the mill hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside was darkness and the smell of rot and time. Caleb stepped through first, his eyes adjusting slowly. The interior was gutted, the machinery long since stripped for parts. Dust covered everything, and in the center of the room, sitting on an overturned crate, was a man. He was old, perhaps 70, with a face carved by sun and hardship. His hair was white and thin, his hands trembling where they rested on his knees. He wore a faded coat and boots that had seen better years. When he looked up at them, his eyes were wet with something that might have been relief or regret. "You came," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Caleb stopped a few paces away. "You sent the letter." The old man nodded. "I did." "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then said, "My name is Thomas Farrow, and I was there the night Orley Taft died." Iris moved to stand beside Caleb. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched at her sides. "Tell us what happened." Thomas looked down at his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he began. "It was 3 years ago, late summer. I was working a small claim north of Coleridge, panning for whatever I could find. I didn't have much. Just a tent, a mule, and a rifle I couldn't shoot straight. One night I heard voices near the creek, men arguing. I stayed hidden, didn't want trouble, but I watched." He paused, his breath shaking. "There were 3 of them. One was Orley Taft. I recognized the badge. The other 2 I didn't know. They were shouting at him, saying he owed them, that he'd taken their money and given them nothing in return. Taft kept saying he'd pay them back, that he needed more time. But they didn't want to hear it." Thomas closed his eyes. "One of them pulled a gun. Taft tried to run. They shot him, twice. He fell into the creek, and the water carried him downstream. They didn't chase him, they just stood there, watching. Then they left." Iris felt her throat tighten. "And you didn't report it?" "I was afraid. I thought if I said anything, they'd come for me too. So I packed up and left, moved south, kept my head down, but it stayed with me. Every night, I saw it again. Saw him fall. Saw the water turn red." Caleb's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "And the body we found, the man in the uniform." Thomas looked up, and there was anguish in his eyes. "That was my brother, Samuel Farrow." The words hung in the air like a weight. Iris took a step back, her mind racing. Caleb remained still, waiting. "He was younger than me," Thomas continued. "Always wanted to do right. When I told him what I'd seen, what I'd done, nothing, he couldn't let it go. He said someone had to speak for Taft, even if the man wasn't innocent. He said silence was just another kind of murder." Thomas's voice broke. "He went to Coleridge 6 months ago, started asking questions, trying to find out who those men were, trying to get someone to listen, but people didn't want to remember. They told him to leave it alone, and then one night he didn't come back." "Someone killed him," Caleb said quietly. "Yes, and they dressed him like a lawman, like Taft. They wanted to send a message, that anyone who dug into the past would end up the same way." Iris knelt in front of Thomas. "Why did you leave him there? Why didn't you come forward?" "Because I'm a coward," Thomas whispered. "Because I thought if I stayed quiet, they'd forget. But they didn't. They found him. They killed him, and it's my fault." Tears ran down the old man's face, and he made no effort to wipe them away. Caleb and Iris exchanged a glance. There was no satisfaction in this truth, only sorrow. They rode back to Coleridge that evening with Thomas between them. He did not resist. He did not ask for mercy. He simply sat in the saddle, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When they arrived, the town was quiet. Lamps were being lit in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Life continued as it always did. Caleb took Thomas to the Mercantile, where Horace Lyman still kept a back room with a lock. He sat the old man down and sent word to Earl Gibbons. The deputy arrived 2 days later, and Thomas Farrow confessed everything. He gave the names of the men he had seen that night, drifters long gone from Kansas, likely dead or in prison by now. He described the place where Taft had fallen, and a search party went out. They found bones in the dried creek bed, half buried in silt. The badge was still there, rusted and bent. Orley Taft was brought back to Coleridge and buried beside the unknown lawman. The marker was changed to read Sheriff Orley Taft, 1839-1884. No one spoke well of him at the service, but they came, because he had been one of them, for better or worse, and because in the end even flawed men deserved a place to rest. Thomas Farrow was taken to Adler Springs to await trial. He would be charged with withholding evidence, possibly as an accessory. His fate would be decided by a judge who had not been there, who had not seen what he had seen. But he accepted it. He said it was lighter than the weight he had carried alone. In the weeks that followed, Coleridge began to change in small, almost invisible ways. People spoke more carefully. They listened more closely. The story of the two bodies, the two badges, the silence that had killed one man and broken another, it became a kind of parable, a reminder that the past did not stay buried, no matter how deep you dug. Virgil Cade sold his ranch and moved east. He never said why, but those who knew him saw the guilt in his eyes. He had known more than he said. He had warned Samuel Farrow to leave, and when the man didn't, Virgil had looked the other way. It was not murder, but it was not innocence either. Samuel Pruitt, the boy who had found the first body, grew quieter as the months passed. His parents worried, but Iris would see him sometimes at the cemetery, standing by the graves with wildflowers in his hands. He was trying to understand something the adults could not explain, the difference between right and wrong, the cost of knowing, the weight of silence. Horace Lyman kept the mercantile running, but he added something new, a small shelf near the counter where he placed a ledger. Anyone could write in it. Names of people who had passed through town, descriptions, dates, a record, so that if someone went missing again, there would be something to start with. It was a small gesture, but it mattered, and Caleb Rust stayed. He had come to Coleridge searching for answers, but he had found something else, a place where his past did not define him, where people knew what he had been, but judged him by what he did now. He took a job helping rebuild the livery. He started attending services at the chapel. He still woke at night sometimes, haunted by the man he had failed to save in Redstone. But the nightmares came less often. Iris was part of that change. She did not push him to talk, did not ask him to be anything other than what he was. But her presence was steady, and over time he learned to trust it. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the hills, and he would tell her things he had never told anyone. About the weight of the badge, about the moment he realized he could not save everyone, about the hope that maybe, someday, he could save someone. In the spring of 1889, Earl Gibbons returned to Coleridge. He had news. The men who killed Orley Taft had been found, one dead in a barroom fight in Missouri, the other serving time in a territorial prison for robbery. Justice, such as it was, had been served. Thomas Farrow had been sentenced to 2 years for obstruction, a light sentence given his cooperation. He would be released in less than 1. Earl delivered the news in the saloon, standing at the bar with his hat in his hands. The room was full, but no one spoke. They listened, and when he finished, there was no celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement. The truth had been found, the dead had been named, and the living could move forward. Before he left, Earl stopped by the boarding house to see Caleb. They stood on the porch, 2 men who had once worn the same badge and carried the same burden. "You did good work here," Earl said. "I just ask questions," Caleb replied. "That's all it takes sometimes." Earl extended his hand, and Caleb shook it. Then the deputy mounted his horse and rode out of town, disappearing into the distance like so many others before him. Years passed. The story of the 2 lawmen became legend, retold around fires and in schoolhouses. Some details were forgotten, others were embellished. But the core remained. A man had seen a crime and stayed silent. Another had sought the truth and paid with his life. And a third had carried the guilt until it nearly destroyed him. Coleridge grew. The railroad finally came through in 1893, bringing new people, new businesses, new hopes. The town that had survived by keeping its head down learned to lift it. A new sheriff was appointed, a young man named Daniel Moss, who wore his badge with humility and care. He kept the 2 stars, the ones found on the body and in the burned livery, in a frame on his office wall. A reminder. Iris Calloway continued to run the boarding house, though she eventually married Caleb Rust in a quiet ceremony at the chapel. They lived simply, working side by side, building something that resembled peace. They never had children, but they were not lonely. The town was their family, and they were woven into its fabric. On warm evenings, they would walk to the cemetery and stand by the 2 graves. Orley Taft and Samuel Farrow, men who had never met in life but were bound in death by the choices of others. Iris would leave flowers. Caleb would stand with his hat in his hands, silent. And together they would remember. Not because the men had been heroes, not because their deaths had been noble, but because their stories mattered, because silence had consequences, and because the act of remembering was itself a kind of justice. Thomas Farrow was released from prison in the fall of 1890. He did not return to Kansas. Some said he went to California, others to Oregon. A few claimed he took a new name and disappeared into the territories. No one knew for certain. But a year after his release, a package arrived at the boarding house addressed to Iris. Inside was a small wooden carving of a mill wheel, delicate and precise, and a note written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for listening, for seeing me not as I was, but as I might still be." Iris placed the carving on the mantel, beside a photograph of her and Caleb on their wedding day, and every time she looked at it she thought about forgiveness, about the long road between guilt and grace, about the way a single choice could ripple forward, changing everything. In the summer of 1902, an old man appeared in Coleridge. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, his face hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat. He went to the cemetery and stood for a long time by the two graves. Then he placed a hand on each marker, bowed his head, and whispered something no one could hear. Iris, who happened to be visiting her husband's parents' plot nearby, watched from a distance. She did not approach. She did not ask questions. But when the man turned to leave, their eyes met for just a moment, and in that glance she saw recognition, regret, and something like peace. The man left town that same day, and no one saw him again. Some said it was Thomas Farrow, come to pay his respects. Others said it was a ghost, a figment of memory. Iris never confirmed or denied. She simply returned home, sat on the porch with Caleb, and told him what she had seen. "Do you think it was him?" Caleb asked. "Does it matter?" Iris replied. Caleb smiled, a rare and quiet thing. "No, I suppose it doesn't." The West was a place of mysteries, of men who arrived without names and left without trace, of stories told and retold until they became myth. But beneath the legend was always truth. Messy, painful, human truth. The kind that did not offer easy answers or clean endings. The kind that asked more questions than it solved. Coleridge learned that, and in learning it, the town became something more than it had been. Not perfect, not innocent, but honest. And that honesty, hard-won and fragile, was enough. The cattle road still ran east, past the split-rail fence where the first body had been found. The fence posts had been replaced over the years, the wood rotting and renewed in cycles. But the road remained, and sometimes travellers passing through would stop and look out over the plains, wondering what stories the land held, what secrets were buried in the dust. They could not know, not fully. But that was the nature of the frontier. It gave up its truths, slowly, reluctantly, and only to those willing to listen. And in Coleridge, there were always those willing to listen. The sun set over the hills, casting long shadows across the graves. The wind moved through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain. And somewhere in the fading light, the past and the present met and made their peace. Because in the end, that was all anyone could hope for. Not justice, not redemption, but the quiet, enduring knowledge that someone had cared enough to remember. And that memory, however small, was enough to light the way forward.